Hello, and welcome to episode 98 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Scottsdale, Arizona, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Ali Mirza, fellow and visiting lecturer at the Center of Humanistic Inquiry and Department of History at Amherst College. As a historian and philosopher of science, Ali's research challenges our standard accounts of how science functions with a focus on the historical sciences. Central to his work is the field of ichnology, the study of how animal behavior changes the structure of the earth and produces new ecosystems through traces such as burrows, footprints, nests, reefs, and more. In his work, Ali attempts to make sense of how paleontologists reconstruct the past using fossils when good modern analogs are not available. Ali's work has introduced a concept which he terms epistemic enhancement, which is when knowledge of an event is better when it is temporarily downstream of the event via its traces than at the event occurrence. In enhanced cases, even if scientists had a time machine and could travel back to witness an event as it was occurring, there would be many aspects of that phenomena happening right in front of them that they couldn't understand until millions of years had passed. Enhancement forces scientists to not only think about causes over deep time, but to think of knowledge generation itself as sometimes a deep time process, that natural forces can induce epistemologically favorable processes in traces. In addition to his research and teaching, Ali organizes a research seminar called Crossing Cabinets at Amherst College that links collections and logistics used by the incredible museum specialists at the Benesky Museum of Natural History, the Archives, the Emily Dickinson Museum, the Center for Russian Culture, and the Mead Art Museum. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Ali. Dr. Ali Mirza, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Friday morning?
I'm doing great. Yeah. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you and welcome you on. How are things out at Amherst?
They're great. Semester's just about to start actually next week. So, convocation is Monday. We've all gotten our robes and things, and courses are about to start. The weather is it's still pretty warm, but it's starting to kind of turn towards, a little bit cooler.
Great. And this will be your second year researching and teaching there. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So the fellowship was 2 years at the Center for Humanistic Inquiry and Department of History. And so, yeah, it'll be, so I'm just starting my second year now.
Fantastic. How was the summer there? Was there a lot of intellectual activity going on? Was there some downtime? What was happening?
Yeah, it was actually fairly busy. The Center for Humanistic Inquiry does this faculty workshop where everybody kind of gets together in a room and works together every Tuesday. And so there are always people around, activities. The college also has different athletic groups coming from high school, middle school, and so, yeah, there's always something it looks like going on.
That's good to hear. That's exciting to hear from our conversations off air when we've just chatted about your time there. It sounds such a rich and vibrant place. And so I'm happy to hear that it's also continues like that through the summer.
Yeah, no.
And so one of the things I thought was interesting too, and why I wanted to have you on, is that we've had a lot of philosophers of science on this program, and perhaps philosophers of science who've done history, perhaps even the last guest we chatted with who's done history. But you're one of those kind of specialty philosophers who's really well known as a historian and philosopher of science. And so for those who might not be so familiar with history and philosophy of science, or HPS as we like to call it, how would you describe the discipline of history and philosophy of science? What does it mean to you?
Well, I think HPS in different places can mean slightly different things. But largely speaking, we are ultimately trying to understand how science works, what makes it tick, how it relates to other kind of human and environmental affairs. And HPS kind of, in a way, takes a bunch of different methodological tools and all piles them together, right? So in my work, for instance, like I do a lot of archival research, but the scientists that I study, they're called ichnologists. And so ichnology essentially is the science of footprints and burrows. It's a pretty deceptive field because it looks like they use words that are similar to words used in biology or geology, but the practices and the application is quite different. And so if you go to the archives and you try to like read through their letters and through their field notes, there's a lot of really important nuances that you'll miss. And so part of what I do is recreate experiments from, say, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. I kind of do a lot of conceptual analysis to clarify what the words mean, how their sense of history, what their sense of historicity is, and then dive into archives and try and reveal, something a little bit deeper than just the veneer that's part of the on the surface scientific descriptions. And I think that's kind of what HPS does really well, is open and broaden your toolkit so that when you're trying to understand how science functions, why it functions, what it cares about, you're not necessarily limited by anything. And I think historians tend to work like this a lot. Like anything can become relevant, right? You might be interested in a particular object, and then you start doing archival work and you start to realize you have to rely on newspapers, you have to rely on expertise from a time period that isn't yours. So now you have to collaborate with somebody from, if you're working in the 19th century, you might have to collaborate with somebody from the 18th century. So I think, it's just a field in which your toolkit is a little bit broadened, and you can pick and choose, what works well.
So you use a lot of terms that I think perhaps those who might have taken a history class, or just those who have, things like archival research and tools, or maybe recreating experiments, things that historians do. So where does the philosophy come in? Where does it feel like you've come, and just from knowing you, I know you have a bit of a philosophy background. We'll get into that. But where do you find the sort of the synthesis and the weaving together to really think more conceptually about some of these ideas that you're also doing a history on?
Yeah. So, I'll give a particular example. So when we're looking at, let's say we're doing philosophy of historical sciences, and that's kind of the literature I'm more part of, right? Like we want to understand how on earth do scientists make inferences from things millions, even billions of years ago. And we've got a bunch of different accounts of how that works, right? One is that we create these like epistemic artifices that are really complicated and they help us like trace what happened in the past. One of the things that had been missed, and I published on this recently, is this notion of epistemic enhancement. And that's actually when you know about something more way after it's happened than you would if you were there when it was happening, right? So the example kind of is, let's say we have a time machine, right? And we go back and we start looking at this worm, making its burrow 200 million years ago. There's a lot about that that's actually really difficult to study because worms still do that. And we actually don't know much about those living worms that make those same forms that we see from 200 million years ago. Because, sediments are really plastic and delicate. And so if you try to like figure out what the shape is or figure out what the worm's doing in the sand, you have to first go into the deep ocean sometimes. You have to really start toying with these things in ways that are impractical. But we have great fossils which are like strengthened and hardened, and you can cut them in half and see what the shape of the burrow is like. Things that were in the deep ocean that are so difficult to access can just be on land, in the form of fossils in an outcrop. And so there are a number of interesting phenomena in which you wouldn't expect that, right? You wouldn't expect that we would be able to know so much more about something after 200 million years versus if we had a time machine and we could observe it. And so this is like a really fundamental right, philosophical consideration of temporality itself, right? I mean, how is information magnified over time? How does that change our understanding of how
Mm,
experimental and historical sciences, for instance, connect? There's a lot of paleontologists that would call themselves paleontologists of the present, where they actually do a bunch of fossil research, but they use that to understand modern things because those modern things can't really be so easily understood, even if they're happening right now. Right. And so this is right. Like if you're, especially for me as somebody who's dealing with, I'm a historian and philosopher of a bunch of scientists that study things from millions of years ago. You can't, you're not going to have a chance of being able to understand that if you don't, make your understanding of the past itself much more sophisticated and questions about scientific methodology and temporality, while at the same time being able to go into the archives and look at their newspapers and letters and their communications and their practices and field notes. So I don't know. Does that kind of...
yeah. Well, I mean, it's just like, again, it's complicated. These things are very complicated. And well, even like just this concept of epistemic enhancement needs unpacking, needs thinking about, and requires a careful analysis. And so I think the thought is, in some degree, the way in which these kinds of questions are complicated, and how to analyze and how to think about them and how to integrate them requires some analytical tools and analytical skills that maybe just a more straightforward historical approach, while critical, while engaged, could benefit from, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And scientific too. I mean,
Yeah.
you really do have to mix the philosophy of science, the history of science, and the science to be able to like entangle these complicated knots of research.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to talk a little bit more about your research. Thanks for sharing. But why don't, before we dive deeper in, let's take a step back. Let's learn a little bit more about you, the person behind the research. So Ali, tell us a little bit about your background and where you grew up.
Yeah, so I was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and then we moved to the United States when I was, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Originally to New Jersey, but 6 months after, when it got a little bit cold, we drove straight down.
That's how you ended in Florida. It was,
yeah, I think Florida is the closest approximation to Pakistan weather or Karachi weather that you can get. And so that's essentially where I grew up until I went to graduate school in Indiana University.
Nice. So what kind of things, growing up in both Pakistan so a little bit in Pakistan, I remember probably have a few memories there, but it's probably early life. And then what kinds of things were you interested in growing up?
Yeah, I mean, so in Pakistan, I mean, it's just, especially when you're like 6 or 7 or before,
Right.
like it's all, a little bit, it's different. The world looks different then. And so, I mean, a lot of outdoor activities, playing outside. I mean, you would get cartoons like maybe 15 minutes a day or something. So there's not much reason to watch TV there, as opposed to when we moved to the United States, you've got Cartoon Network kind of 24/7 kind of a thing.
Right.
And for me, I mean, I think growing up, I remember I was really interested in biology, like just reading about cells and things. This is maybe in elementary school, something like that. Gaming, like strategy gaming, StarCraft, stuff like that. Video games were huge for me. I mean, I honestly think they're such a great collaborative tool. Like you really learn how to play as a team and work together. Same with, and martial arts, I think, was probably my first love, and that's around middle school, high school, that I really love to just be in an atmosphere where everybody is just active doing something.
Yeah.
And yeah,
there's also pretty strong communities within those spaces too, like video games and then martial arts. There's like, there could be a following of stuff, and I don't know.
For sure, yeah. I mean, a very strong community. But at the same time, I was also really interested in the connection between science and religion, So that kind of, I'd say maybe end of high school, I read, there's a Pakistani poet whose book, his name was Muhammad Iqbal. So he had this book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought. And in it, he like essentially adopts evolutionary theory, like Darwinian evolutionary theory. And so I know around high school, that was pretty interesting to me and kind of started some of my curiosities that would later, develop into slightly more professional routes.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. So, at that time, high school time, what did you want to be when you grew up? What were you hoping to do in terms of professional life?
I don't think I knew at the time. I mean, high school was a little bit rough. I think I was waiting to see what college would be like.
Sure.
Kind of have some experiences and then begin to triangulate, and I honestly didn't find exactly what I wanted to do until after undergrad, I think.
Okay. So I know a lot of us, in the realm of finding their way to things like philosophy of science, history and philosophy of science, they can go on circuitous routes. So was there a straightforward path for you, or was there a little bit of bobbing and weaving to different things?
No, I mean, it's never been straightforward. My bachelor's degree was in systems engineering. My master's degree was in philosophy. Then my PhD in Indiana was in history and philosophy of science. My first postdoc was in the Department of Geology at the University of Saskatchewan. And then my current fellowship is on the theme of political imagination, as a fellow and visiting lecturer in the Center for Humanistic Inquiry and Department of History. So, yeah, I mean,
where could be your next position is going to be. I don't know. I'm trying to imagine how can you top the Department of Humanistic Inquiry? Like it's gonna be something.
And I think this is the first time I felt like I have all the tools I need to be able to do the work that I wanted to do, because every place since, I mean, even in doing my PhD in Indiana, we knew I needed to spend time with scientists, and we knew I needed to go here and there. So I think, yeah, I'm excited to see.
Well, so what then, so you mentioned working, studying systems engineering, and that's a very common sort of background of folks who might work in a particular science or technology based sort of profession and then find their way. Was there sort of an event or a mentor or something that you found to connect you then to ultimately like a professional life in HPS?
A little bit. So the thing was, while I was doing system engineering, I mean, it's a great degree, but I felt intellectually claustrophobic. Like being a Pakistani American, I did not have much context for what I was doing with my life. And so, questions about, just why would you be an engineer? What are you trying to contribute to? Were pretty important. And I also never felt like I had at the time very good skills for discourse. Like, how do you discuss and figure out what a good argument is or isn't? And so that's why instead of accepting and going into engineering, I decided to start grad school in philosophy. I just wanted to start really high and abstract and try and work my way down into a different concrete situation. Trying to get tools that I didn't think I had when I was younger. And so, yeah, the philosophy thing was really just a jump to something that would give me arguing tools. My mom always loved history, so that was never far. What ended up happening was I joined a department at the University of South Florida, which had a pretty heavy history of philosophy component. So a lot of the faculty there, Roger Aria, Alex Levine, I mean, these guys were thinking very much through how do we do philosophy as historians. And I also got introduced to Eric Winsberg there. Philosophy of simulation. And so through that kind of community, I began to triangulate on, the kind of more HPS aspects that I wanted. And actually, it was in Florida. I got to take courses on Jewish philosophy. I got to take courses on feminist science, on medieval physics, on paleontology. Actually, my first paleontology course was in Florida. And so I knew at the time that I absolutely adored paleontological research and this kind of, not just doing the science, but looking at what the scientists are doing and trying to understand it. And I think from there on, the trajectory was pretty clear.
Great. So as you know, and as I know, you end up at Indiana University in the History and Philosophy of Science department, and so for listeners know, Ali and I first met during his first year. I think I was also studying HPS, we happened to meet at a friend's like gathering. I think it was like Paul's. I think was there. We were doing some kind of I don't know. He was having a game night or just kind of an introductory welcoming party for the new recruits, and it was. And then the rest is history. But yeah, so grateful to get to have met you at that time and to have been friends all this time. But what was your experience? Yeah, what has been your experience then in developing yourself professionally, and how did that experience inform your thinking in HPS?
I mean, I think the one thing that really helped me in Indiana was that I had the resources to be able to get the starting toolkit I needed for my work, right? So my advisors, Sander Glebov, Yuda Shikore, Sandy's a historian of biology. Yuda does integrated HPS. As a research assistant for Christoph Ermscher on, his supplement to his book on Agassiz. The department was willing to let me spend a lot of time with the paleontologists. So, I got the opportunity to have dinner every week with David Pauli, who's a vertebrate paleontologist, and his students, and take courses with him. And so I think IU was great for me because it let me customize what I needed for the work that I was doing, and also get little bits of expertise that would help kind of take that to the next level. And also I think just having a really active group of colleagues, right? Like, I mean, we always got to go and spend time about, after every course, you can go to a bar and talk about work for another 3, 4, 5 hours or whatever else, right? So just having a lot of different feedback and people to bounce your ideas off of, I think was, for me, it was really transformative.
What I remember was just the experience. There's a lot of folks there who were just very encouraging of just, if you want to explore something, go do it. Like that was like a really positive thing. And also, oh, you want to explore this? Oh, I happen to know this person. Let me introduce you. So there was a real strong network and an encouragement to just do kind of your own thing. And everyone in that department was kind of doing their own thing to some degree, and kind of almost, they were a little entrepreneur of their own making, of their own research program, very much so. It was not like, here's a PI, we do this PI's work. It was every person was their own PI, so to speak, in sort of developing their research program from day one, essentially.
Yeah, that's what I loved about graduate school, was that you could really start off knowing that if there's something you want to do, everyone will kind of coalesce around that and help you get the resources, even the resources that you didn't think you would need.
Yeah. So in terms of kind of ultimately what you ended up doing your doctoral dissertation work on, what was kind of the project, and ultimately what were some of the takeaways from it?
So I mean, my dissertation was essentially my first take at the history and philosophy of ichnology, trying to understand why is it that fossil footprints and burrows have been such a source of fascination for scientists. And during the course of that, I think there's really 3 things I learned that have become fundamental. One is studying things like traces, like footprints and burrows, changes the way these scientists think. And so even when they stop working on footprints and burrows, the way they behave and act changes. So, the field of ichnology starts actually at Amherst College in the 1830s, and a collection of fossil footprints ends up being kind of central and part of the crediting of saving the college from financial ruin. You've got footprints on the student magazine at the time in the 1850s, which used to be called the Amherst, student magazine, or collegiate magazine. Then it got called the Ichnology. You've got like little, the footprints never far from the college, right? They're like part of campus discourse and culture. Later, the Navy is funding research on it. The petroleum industry has funded more research on footprints and burrows than almost anybody else. And so I began to realize that there was a much bigger story here. And the fact that we don't encounter footprints and burrows in fossilized forms in our daily lives doesn't mean that researchers working on them haven't actually transformed many things we take for granted. And so I knew the dissertation helped me realize that I had actually a massive project on my hand, and really 200 years of research that hadn't had a comprehensive history and philosophy told about them. And for good reason too, right? There are reasons why the archives have been difficult to interpret, and people haven't been able to crack them. But yeah, so that really helped me. The dissertation was central for helping me realize what I had underneath me in terms of the source, but also what things I would need to do to be able to crack this really difficult project. The dissertation was a first take at it, but being able to work with the best scientists, in the world, like Gabriela Mangano and Louis Boutoy at the University of Saskatchewan, is transformative. I mean, as a historian and philosopher of science, to be able to just go to Spain looking for footprints and burrows on the coastline and go to museums with, this huge research group.
Yeah, tell us about this. Right. So you go, you complete your PhD and you hit the ground running, and you end up in a department of geology. So tell us about, like that story, and because that's when people might be like, wait, you were in engineering, you've done HPS, which is great, but now you're in geology. So what was that like? And what kinds of things did that afford you?
Well, the interesting thing is, so I met Gabriela and Luis at the Geological Society of America meeting in, 2016, something like that. And both of them also have what's equivalent to a master's degree in philosophy. But also philosophy for them also has they're historical scientists. They think about things from millions of years ago. So for them, history is never behind. So they are, massive fans of, archival research and doing historical work. And I think they also know the history of their field. They know that their field is remarkable and interesting and has made all sorts of, interesting and also positive contributions to the world, but nobody's quite told that. And so that postdoc was really an opportunity to, proceed in that kind of way, to kind of revisit questions from Ichnology's past that we haven't had time to explore. How did it develop? What does its future look like? I think it has a very strong contribution to make to conservation science. So a lot of these things kind of coalesced, and it was understood from the beginning that I would be the historian and philosopher of Ichnology in the department, right? That we weren't necessarily trying to turn me into a geologist. Right. Of course, the best way to do that is actually just to pretend you're a geologist, at least for a while. And so for the first 6 months, it was lab work, field work. It was really just absolute immersion and trying to, behave exactly like a scientist. And then the second half of the postdoc was, now that immersion is there, what can we do with this? And so we've got works in collaboration that we're doing. And I think honestly, when I got there, I realized that, scientific publishing, when you're reading, even if you're reading letters, but especially published papers, there's such a veneer of, we all know that there's always this veneer to publication, but it really helped me appreciate how much depth there's underneath it, and how to write history that doesn't fall for those traps, right? Just because the discovery or realization is worded a particular way in a scientific publication doesn't mean that that's how we got there. Again, these are things we
No, that's
know,
important.
but it's different to know how to figure out what's underneath the veneer than just knowing that there is something underneath. And I think collaborations are like fundamental to that.
Great. And so it sounds, and you mentioned a trip to Spain. Is that right?
Yeah, and actually, that maybe there's a cool lesson in there. So I've been really interested in how this field of footprints and burrows developed in Amherst in the 1830s. I think the most significant thing that happened that helped unlock that for me was talking to researchers like Laura and Jose at the Museum of the Jurassic in Asturias, Spain, and seeing how they were thinking about footprints. The footprint collection there looks completely, you would think dinosaur footprints look like they all, even if it's made by the same dinosaur, you would think they all look the same. But depending on what the preservation is, whether it's sandstone, mudstone, how it's being, extricated and moved from the field to the museum, the museum there looks completely different from the museum in Amherst. But it helped me so much, like seeing that contrast helped put things together for me in Amherst, where when I got here, I could, discuss things with Haley Singleton in the Benesky Museum of Natural History or in the Amherst Archives with Mike Kelly, and start to like tease apart things that we had never noticed before. And honestly, the first step of that was just understanding how scientists in Spain are kind of developing Hitchcock's work. I mean, he's from 200 years ago, and yet they're still reading him and being able to get interesting insights. And so, yeah, I think getting out, working with scientists from different areas, from, distant places, and using that to help provide contrast for what you do in a particular, very different locale, can be tremendously beneficial.
Thank you. Oh, I appreciate that. That sounds like some wonderful and very enhancing experiences. I want to hear a little bit more about Amherst, but before that, I wanted to ask a little bit about some of your major works so far. So I've noticed you have two great publications. One of them, the first related to history, and then one in philosophy. Could you tell us a little bit about those works and, a little bit of what they've meant to you?
Yeah. So, those works have been really helpful for getting certain like tool skills down. The history publication is on Alexander Dalrymple, who was the first hydrographer of the British Admiralty. And I'm essentially trying to reinterpret parts of Charles Darwin's first book, The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs, through this hydrography lens, so through more of a theoretical hydrography lens. Like Alistair Sponsel has done great stuff on this as well, showing how, just working with hydrographers and sailors aboard the Beagle would have affected Darwin's sense of biology and zoology and botany and how to, make natural historical inferences. I was more interested in a little bit on issues of control. The British Admiralty at the time, Dalrymple particularly start to think, based on actually local indigenous knowledge, that maybe you can predict the seafaring conditions you're going to face by the shape of the coral islands. And so what Dalrymple starts to think is, if coral islands and their shape is determined by the waves and the wind, maybe we can just look at a chart and see the shape of the island and predict what's going to happen in other places. So the Admiralty really wants to convert the coral reefs into like natural instruments. And reefs, of course, are tremendously dangerous, right? I mean, you could spend immense money, train sailors, send them to somewhere distant and bring important goods. And then you get that boat gets stranded on a reef somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, and you never hear from anybody again. So this issue of trying to control the reefs ends up being quite central to the Admiralty's interests. And I think kind of my story was both that Darwin realizes that it's coral behavior corals behave in really unpredictable ways depending on the species and all sorts of environmental factors. And he kind of puts a little bit of a damper on the Admiralty's hopes by saying these networks, these ecological systems are so complicated that you just can't read the environment directly off of it. And so coral behavior in a bizarre way like thwarts the British Admiralty's attempts to control nature, at least for a little bit of time. And also in the course of that work, I was able to notice something in Darwin's chart, which is, the biggest chart he made of the world and all the different kinds of coral islands on it. So I was the first, as far as I know, to notice that the island of New Caledonia was at the center of the chart. And so some of that work for me has been like, why was the island of New Caledonia so important to him when he didn't visit it? And central there is that actually Darwin was using its charts in really interesting ways. So that also, I think, helped me as a researcher kind of learn we know how to use newspapers and books and letters, but also to use charts and now objects and other things to kind of tell history through multiple mediums. Yeah.
Well, I love thank you for that, an excellent overview. And I love how you started off essentially by saying, like, this is one of those things where not only do you produce this kind of work and find out these really interesting questions that haven't been explored, but you've adopted the particular tools and sort of take homes along the way in terms of what's another tool in your toolkit to contribute toward HPS, which I've noticed is a theme going on here. So when you're not doing like this really cool history work, but you're doing somewhat related like philosophy work, like this other publication, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the philosophy of science work I have this was a little bit of trying to capture something important for scientists, but also trying to capture a new sense of historicity. And that was the notion of enhancement that I kind of talked about earlier is, we've got this view, that, the more distant the past, the more darker and kind of, difficult to understand it is. I mean, and it does happen in vertebrate paleontology, for instance, you would call it the pull of the present. Like we know a lot about the morphologies of more modern animals and recent animals, but the further back you go in time, things get a lot more difficult. But that's kind of become, I think, a predominating view about just how temporality itself works. And I think people forget that there's 2-3 different fossil records. There's the fossil record of bodies. There's the fossil record of behavior, which is traces and footprints and burrows and these kind of things.
Right.
And they all exhibit different senses of historicity. So, in the case of footprints and burrows, you get the reverse. You actually get the pull of the past, where it's easier to understand things, some things from much longer ago than things more recent. And so kind of the story the picture I want to paint is that when we're thinking about how history works for us and how we can use history, we have to like expand again our toolkit. Like we have to begin to think of history in more diverse ways. And this is part of a broader thing too, right? Like there's work on indigenous literature, Paulette Steeves, Lisa Brooks, Jonathan Hill has stuff on this where we're kind of pointing out that our modern view of time is this like linear kind of, even if it's not progressive, that it's linear, right? And you put little like marks on each day, that's not the only view to have. There's spiraling conceptions of time. Hill's work on the Wakwanae in Brazil points out that, there are groups there that feel that if you travel away from their homelands, you're actually traveling in a sense backwards in time, or you're able to be influenced by forces, from the past in a different way. So there's all kinds of like circular spiraling, different conceptions of time, and I think geologists actually do that kind of stuff more than has been appreciated. And so enhancement was kind of my first crack at showing that. But there's more in the pipeline too.
Of course, of course. No, I mean, this is just the start of a number of things. Well, congratulations on those. And so I know, so you mentioned Amherst a lot, and also how it's kind of connected and been sort of a great fit for your work in Ichnology. What kinds of things have you been up to while there, like teaching wise, and also like what are you looking forward to doing this coming year?
Yeah, so I mean, I've taught a course called The Myth of the Past, which looks at how diverse research cultures in different places and distant times had conceived of and engaged with the past. So this is called the past in the past. And this is a course, I mean, you kind of mentioned that I'm always thinking about like historical and philosophical tools, right? So this is a course in which we kind of went through like 16 different ways of engaging with the past, right? Enhancement is one. There's linearity, there's revolutions, there's simultaneity, there's other things too, like historical reproduction. So, for instance, we had a curated visit to the Emily Dickinson Museum where we talked about how you can use horsehair canvas and furniture and wallpaper to, reproduce those from the past and use that to write better history. For instance, we would go to the Center for Russian Culture and look at futurist literature, or defamiliarization and think about how to write history less anachronistically. This is a course in which we kind of try to do a lot of hands-on work, of what it feels like to engage with the past in different ways. And that's also been kind of a byproduct of at Amherst. I've organized this research seminar for staff and faculty called the Crossing Cabinets one, where we kind of look at this thing where, the archives might get papers, the Mead Art Museum might get artistic works, the Benesky gets natural history collections, but there's all sorts of interesting connections, right? The documentation in the archives might be for something in the Benesky, the artwork in the Mead might be a drawing, a really gorgeous drawing of something in the natural history collection. So there are a lot of so for instance, my current work has been looking at how fossil footprints and ancient Assyrian reliefs from the palace of Ashur-nasirpal II were actually supposed to be put side by side and were being interpreted together. So a lot of these unexpected things where you would think this dinosaur footprints and reliefs from, 3,000, 800 BC from ancient Assyrian palace would have nothing to do with each other. But these kind of collaborations where we sit and talk and go through connections that we have between each other's, disciplines and museums and collections, have been, for me, like very, very insightful and encouraging.
That's wonderful to hear. And so I think you've mentioned something where like you're starting to bring a lot of people together, and what started as somewhat of a smaller group has come a little bit larger. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely growing. Yeah, I mean, I think the networks are growing. I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is because I do history and philosophy of an interdisciplinary research field, Ichnology. Ichnology is smack dab in the middle of, I mean, God knows how many disciplines, right? It's
Right.
sedimentology and petrology and, ecology. And so the scientists I study are is sometimes it's hard to even keep track of where they're going, but they're actually not, there is a method to their madness. They know how to stitch fields together. And so for me, it's difficult not to try and recreate aspects of that in my own work, specifically when you're studying scientists or humanists that, cut across multiple disciplines. And one of the things I've realized is that interdisciplinarity is difficult to get, and you have to do a lot of infrastructure building for it. And that, there's misunderstandings. You're not, if you're doing history of science and HPS and philosophy of science and museum studies, you're not spreading yourself thin, depending on your project. Sometimes it's fundamental. Like, you cannot be a good historian of science if you don't do these things in the area that I work in. And I actually, the line that stuck out to me, Gabriella at the University of Saskatchewan said once, during a ichnology course. She said, before you can be a good ichnologist, you have to be a superb sedimentologist, right? Like you have to really like go down this checklist depending on what you're working on. In some cases, the best thing for you and your work is to stick exactly within your disciplinary boundaries. But that all has to be determined by, like what you're facing, what the context is. And so, yeah, my network's definitely grown, but in a way that, still feels generative, and everything kind of mutually benefits.
Wonderful. Well, can you tell us a little bit about what projects you're currently most excited about?
Oh, for right now, I think it would have to be my book.
Okay.
So I've been working on a book manuscript called Mind and Earth. So, I mean, kind of to give extended elevator pitch, it's based on the intersection between 19th and 20th century natural history, environmental history, and the history of extractivistic movements, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism. It's trying to show how Western organizations like militaries, petroleum companies, colleges, encountered fossils as a means to exert direct control over natural resources and construct cultural capital. So this is kind of the first to reveal that this wasn't just through traditional fossils like bones, but really through fossil traces. So I alluded to this where one of the model events is how a collection of fossil footprints was credited for saving Amherst College from financial ruin in the 1840s. And so I kind of track how this affected New England culture and politics, shaping the architecture of building, the heads of the largest petroleum companies, how non-autochthonous peoples incorporated the natural history of the area to create the facade of indigeneity. The Charles Darwin dealing with the British Admiralty and coral reefs, scientists with the Navy in the 1930s discovering that burrowing creatures were as important for the movement of Earth's sediments as the winds and waves, and used that to inform the construction of ports. Petroleum industries. But also, I think important for me is that as the field became more international, a lot of those extractivistic elements were eroded away. So it contributed to evolutionary theory, ecology, conservation, the link between art and science. And importantly, that these aren't like case studies. This is actually a part of a shared network of researchers that is doing all this while moving around the world. And I think, an important thing to kind of speak to at the end is, Ichnology did all of these interesting things. It went around the world, but as it's become less extractivistic, the research and the burden of connecting it to, say, conservation science or ecology has been left to researchers that are not funded by the big organizations that funded it in the past. And so, a series of unfortunate deaths, for instance, in the US means that the United States has very little ichnology left anymore. And all the work is being left to researchers in China and Poland and Canada and Argentina. So this is, really substantial blind spot. And I want to use the book as a way to flag the importance of the research, but also how fickle this kind of knowledge is, how you can have, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the US had a very strong ichnological research body, and now it's very, very heavily diminished. So to kind of speak to those themes is important to me, and I'm quite passionate about it.
Well, I would assume so, but no, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. How are you going to convince and motivate folks? I mean, history is not always about, taking a positive program and corrective action. It's about explaining and exploring the depths of a particular issue. But is there sort of a positive program to be had in terms of motivating, more present work and current work going forward?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it depends. Like the book project is very historical, but I think what's important about the history that has a lot of contemporary relevance. We have a lot of blind spots where we still think, when we think of conservation, we don't always appreciate, those ecosystem engineers, those worms and little critters earthworms we appreciate, but there's a lot of, shrimp in the deep sea and shallow marine environments that do really, really important ecological work. And so, understanding how to live with these kinds of creatures that are kind of fundamental to certain ecosystems is a blind spot. I mean, there's the desert fallacy where we think that biodiversity in cities has to be less than in nature, right? We have a lot of presuppositions about what urban environments can or can't look like. And so what I'm essentially trying to do is show how there's a body of researchers that has a lot of great tools that help us figure out exactly how particular animals develop certain ecosystems and habitats. And ultimately, the long-term project is to figure out how to incorporate that into, say, how we engineer our cities, of landscape architecture or anything else to that effect. So I think, it is, of course, a very big project, but I think, most of the people I study had very big project, and it took them 40, 50 years before things coalesced. But I think you can, throughout the way, show why it's important and that people do respond to it, right? I mean, if you show the historians that this was so important in the 1830s and 1930s, they respond to that. If you show philosophers of science that there's an entirely new sense of historicity underpinning this, and our meaning of what the scientific method is has to be radically altered yet again, they respond to that. So I think, just gradually trying to show why it matters pays off long term.
Excellent. Well, I love the title. I love the motivation, and I love your ideas in terms of, what we can do to motivate this kind of the contemporary relevance for this work. So appreciate you sharing. I'm looking forward to its pending and future release, I should say. So we're coming to the end. So unfortunately, we have to wrap up with our final question. So you've been around HPS, history and philosophy of science, for a while. So I think what I'll do is I'll augment the question a little bit that I usually ask in relation not only to philosophy of science, but why don't we pose it to history and philosophy of science? So Ali, what do you think is the greatest challenge facing history and philosophy of science today?
To me, just based on my experiences, the burden that we have is quite large, because we are probably in one of the few fields which is, and STS as well, ideally suited to bridging the STEM humanities divide, right? Like, I think people have a lot of misunderstandings about what scientific research is like, what empiricism is like, how art figures into it, how aesthetics figures into it, how industry figures into it. And so, it's, a lot of these more social misunderstandings, which have a lot of negative consequences, right? It is largely up to us to find solutions to that. So I think, to me, that just by its nature is such a big burden. But, kind of like little components of it, figuring out how to be collaborative isn't always easy, right? Like, I work with scientists who are very welcoming to historical archival and conceptual analysis. And so that was a bit easier for me, but how to do that in many other areas is not always as straightforward. I think public outreach, right? Like, we still, like making podcasts, making documentaries, all of these things can actually be really, really great for research. But we don't really consider them academic work. So I think my worry just is that we can do great academic research, but given how capricious things can be, lose our ability to justify what we do at a broader scale. And that means, that has a lot of implications. I think part of that is also, I almost feel as if every historian and philosopher of science should do 10%, 20% of their institute's history, right? Like, knowing why your field is positioned in your institute the way it's positioned, and what hurdles you're facing in trying to overcome that, and having a community that kind of talks about that more. And then getting that, if you're convinced that historical and philosophical analysis is so great and powerful, I think the logical extension of that is you think that should apply to where you are in your own job hiring, right? So
I would hope so, but you're right. I think
we don't see that much. At least I don't think we see it as much as would be nice. So I think those are all really difficult things, and there's a lot at stake in it.
Okay. Well, Ali, it was a real pleasure getting to chat in this way. Thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, this was wonderful. Yeah,
Thank you
I
so much
wish
for
you,
having me. That was really fun. Thanks.
of course. Yeah, yeah. I wish you the best. We'll catch up more soon. But otherwise, yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day and good luck at the beginning of the semester.
Sounds good. Have a great day.
All right.
Bye.
Bye bye.